Okay, so throughout this webinar on Microsoft Graph API and OutSystems, feel free to ask questions. On top of the Teams client, you find that Q&A button, and feel free to add your questions while I'm presenting. Unfortunately, I will not be able to answer the questions while I'm talking. So we reserve that to the end of the webinar. And if I don't make it to answer all the questions after the webinar, I promise that I will reach out to you individually and answer all your questions you put in the Q&A part. You will also find the presentation in the chat, so you should be able to access the chat. And there is one PDF which contains all the slides. Which contains all the slides I'm presenting today. But of course, our focus is on doing something in OutSystems. But unfortunately, we have to do some theory before we start in something. Okay, so still people are joining. Okay. Okay, let's start. So welcome all. It's actually astounding that so many have registered and so many of you are participating in my first OutSystems public webinar about Microsoft Graph API and OutSystems. So why did I create that webinar? Pretty easy. Quite often you see on the forums people asking about how do I connect to Microsoft Graph or to REST APIs that are protected by an authorization server, which implements the OAuth 2 protocol. We see that in a bit what that is. And so I decided that is a good topic. Let's make a webinar out of it. And every time a new question comes up in the future on the forums, I simply paste the recording of this webinar. That makes it pretty easy. My name is Stefan. I work for Telelink Business Services, Germany, which is part of a larger organization with its headquarters in Bulgaria. This year, I had the honor to get recognized as an OutSystems MVP, and I take this title or achievement, whatever, very seriously. So for me, it's all about providing value to the community, to you guys, because I think it is my strong belief that with a strong community, this leads to a higher adoption of the OutSystems platform and to higher or to more high-value solutions built with it, which is good for us all, especially for us that work for an OutSystems partner. So for today, we have a tight schedule, a tough agenda. And if you read my forum post, I decided to split it up into two webinars because I didn't want to take so much time off your workday. So I split it up into two parts, one where we consume Graph API as an application, and the other part where we consume Graph API on behalf of a user. And what that is, we'll find out in a bit. Okay. Doesn't work. Okay. So we're talking first about some theory. So a short introduction to what is the Microsoft Graph API. And for most, Graph API is protected by a standard authorization framework, which is called OAuth, OAuth 2.0. That's the current version of that protocol. And we talk about access tokens and what is an identity provider, and specifically what is the Microsoft Identity Platform and Microsoft Identity Provider. And we're talking about how to get an access token, which authorizes to consume a Graph API, which is also called OAuth grant types. Last but not least, we look a little bit at scopes and permissions. So we need permissions to get access to Graph API. And that concludes our theory part. And then we switch over to Service Studio and do all the implementation things you need to do in order to get access and consume Microsoft Graph API. So what is Graph API? So the Microsoft Graph is a set of Microsoft cloud services, like Outlook, Teams, SharePoint, OneDrive, and many, many, many more. So lots of services that connect to each other, exchanging information, exchanging data. So that is the Graph. And the Graph API is on top of it, which enables you to have a unified REST API accessing all those services. So that's basically the Graph API. So a single RESTful web service you can access and consume one or more Microsoft Cloud services. And there are the many. So the 4 here is just a fraction of what you can access with the Graph API. In order to access Graph API, you need an access token. And since sometimes I see that people struggle a little bit, what's an access token, an OAuth access token, and what is the OpenID thing people are talking about, OpenID Connect tokens. So an access token is something that grants you access to a resource. So for example, OneDrive, to get all the files of OneDrive, or to send an email. So the access token authorizes you to get access to that resource and do things with it. The OpenID Connect token, which is on top of the OAuth authorization framework, is a JSON web token that contains information about the identity of a user. So nothing more. So it's just an identity token you can use to extract, for example, the first name, the last name, a birth date, whatever inside an OpenID Connect token you can use in an application to do things. For example, creating a user or setting an attribute of a user, but it's not for authorizing a request to a resource. And access tokens, so for us that we want to consume a Graph API resource, we're only interested in an access token. So an OpenID Connect token, typically they are needed when you want to provide single sign-on for your application and want to automatically create a user account in your factory. Or if you want to set certain attributes of a user, like the birthday or anything else, then you would need the Connect token. But just for accessing resources, only the access token is relevant. And the access token is issued by an identity provider. And the good thing is, once you know how to get an access token using the Microsoft identity provider that implements the OAuth 2 protocol, you know how to consume any other OAuth 2 compatible identity provider like Okta, Auth0, Keycloak. I like Keycloak, very nice open source product. And any service that uses an OAuth 2 compatible identity provider, like Facebook, Google, Spotify, Fitbit. So there are lots of services that implement the OAuth 2 authorization framework for accessing their APIs. And the Microsoft identity provider protects the Graph API in your tenant. So your Microsoft 365 account is a tenant, is so-called a tenant. And the Microsoft identity provider protects all the resources across your tenant. If you noticed, Microsoft recently renamed their Azure AD part, so their identity platform, to Entra. Entra is more than just an identity provider. It includes additional tools, for conditional access policies and monitoring and lots of other stuff. And the identity provider that issues access tokens and OpenID Connect tokens, that is just one part of Microsoft Entra. I still struggle with the new name, so I hope you don't mind if I mention Azure AD instead of Microsoft Entra throughout the course. Okay, so the identity provider grants you or issues an access token, and there are three prominent ways. So the most used ways, the most modern ways of issuing an access token. The first one is called the so-called client credentials flow, which is server-to-server communication. So in that case, you have an OutSystems application, so just an application, and it asks the identity provider, hey, here are my credentials. We see that in a bit. Here are my credentials. Please give me an access token that I can use to consume Graph API or any other service. So this is for server-to-server interactions. The authorization code flow is whenever the application, your application, needs to access resources on behalf of a user. And this flow requires that the user who is sitting in front of the application has a browser, and that browser redirects the user to the identity provider, in this case, Entra, where the user needs to authenticate, so providing email address, password, maybe multi-factor, whatever. And then the identity provider issues an authorization code to your server application, to your backend, that then asks for an access token. So it exchanges the authorization code for an access token and then uses that access token to access Graph API resources on behalf of a user. There is a special code flow, which is called authorization code flow with proof key exchange. This is, for now, mostly used for applications that are not able to store credentials. You need to acquire an access token securely. So mostly mobile applications, progressive web applications, so client-side applications, where you need an additional level of security, and you have to prevent that, that credentials, that security credentials are stored somewhere in plain text or whatever. A special code flow is device code flow. Sometimes you see this on TV applications. So you open the application and then it displays a code and a link, and you go to that link, enter a code, and then your device gets an access token. So you enter that code and link on another device, and then you get an access token directly transmitted to your TV or whatever external device. So it's suitable for all access token acquisitions where you have limited input possibilities. Okay, so for today, we're only dealing with a client credentials flow, so server-to-server communication. And in the next part, I hope I will make it in December, we do the same on behalf of a user. So, okay, no, not switching. Okay, so scopes and permissions. So having an access token does not give you full access to everything. You have to specify what is your application allowed to do, or your application on behalf of a user is allowed to do. And Graph API differentiates between two types of permissions: application permissions. So this is a permission, for example, to send an email or to read user details or whatever directly to an application. So you do not know the user, you just grant the application the permission to read people data via Graph API. And the other one is user permissions, also called delegated permissions, where a user, where you need an access token that acts on behalf of a user to read certain details. So user permissions are limited to the permissions a single user has. Application permissions, typically, we see that when we implement an example, application permissions are in many ways more powerful than user permissions. So for example, granting a user the right to send an email limits the user to send an email only via his mailbox or her mailbox. When you do the same for an application, by default, the application then has the right permission to send an email via all mailboxes in your organization. Okay, so this is more powerful. For application permissions, you use the client credentials flow we talked about. And for user permissions, you need to implement the authorization code flow, which is part of the next webinar. So, and that's it for the theory part. Let's do some practical things. We have to do some prerequisites, and you need to have certain rights to do so. So you need access to your Azure tenant via the Azure portal. And you need to have at least the Cloud Application Administrator role to be able to register an application, which is the first thing we have to do. So just let me switch over to my desktop screen. So I hope you see my screen now. And the first thing you need to do is you have to tell Entra that this is your application, or you have to register an application with Entra to retrieve an access token. And you do that via the Azure portal. You log on. And then look for app registrations. And what you do is, by clicking on new registration, we register a new application. So this is our OutSystems webinar. We want to allow accounts from our directory only, so from our organization only, but you can also set it to multi-tenant so that you allow business-to-business accounts to log on via your application. For client credential flow, this is not very interesting. We will see and configure that more intensively when we talk about authorization code flow. But for client credentials flow, you just give it a name, click on register, and having now a registered application immediately allows the application to retrieve an access token by providing credentials. So, but we have to configure that credentials by issuing a secret. And this is what we do next. So we click here on certificates and secret and add a new client secret, give it a description, first secret. And when that secret expires, so you should choose a smaller number, like 90 days. So secrets should rotate over time, which is actually a good practice. Then you click Add. And please note that the value here, you have to copy immediately. So once you refresh that page, you cannot copy the value anymore. So this is what we do. We copy the secret value. And let me just post that down. Okay. And having now a secret, next we define what permissions do we grant to our application. And this is done in the API permissions part. And I was asking in the survey form, so what interests you most, what endpoint interests you most? And most people ask for sending an email, so this is what we do. So we are granting now our application to send an email via Graph API. So we add we first remove that user read thing. We don't need it. We don't want to read user things here. And we add a permission. We choose the Graph API. We want to grant the permission to our application. Then search for mail. You can also browse to mail and click on mail sent and add the permission. So when you add an application permission, that is true for most application permissions. It has that status not granted. Since application permissions are very, very powerful, in this case, this permission grants the application to send email using all your organizational mailboxes. Okay, so you can strip that down by application policies, but by default, this permission gives me now the right to send an email using all the mailboxes I have in my organization. And since this is so powerful, there is an additional, let's say, approval necessary by an administrator, so by a cloud application administrator that needs to grant admin consent before you can actually use this permission in your application. So this is what we do next. We grant the admin permission, and now it's granted for my domain. And now we can actually go ahead and use this registration, this client secret to acquire an access token for consuming Graph API. You have multiple options in acquiring an access token using OutSystems. So the first thing is you can do it manually. And I created a small sample application, which we fill out throughout this webinar. And later on, I post it on Forge for you to download. And that sample application has one service module, which I called Entra Token Service. This is a service that issues access tokens, or it acquires access tokens via Entra, and then outputs that access token to be used for consuming Graph API services, which is in our case another service module where we implement the consuming part of Graph API. So we start off by using the Entra token. So we have another one. Okay, people are still coming in late. So, and I already created some, some empty server actions. So consuming a token is actually pretty easy. One option is to do it manually via a REST consume action. So every OAuth compatible identity provider has an endpoint, a so-called token endpoint. And in Entra, or in the app access registration, you can look up your token endpoint via overview endpoints and copy the OAuth 2 token endpoint. So that's it. Now we copy that, and then we add a consume action. a single method, which is a post to this token endpoint. And posting to a token endpoint to acquire a token is a form. So with some parameters, we have to tell the token endpoint that we want to do a client credentials flow. So that's the grant type, credentials. And next, we have to provide a so-called client ID and a client secret. So this is client ID. And the client ID we find out by, once again, going to the overview and copying the application client ID. It's this one. Next, the client secret, which we hopefully copied before. And last but not least, at least one scope. And what is a scope? The scope can be found here. So if I collapse that, Microsoft Graph is a single scope. And oh wow, we have another one. And this mail sent is the permission. And the default scope for Microsoft Graph is an URI, an URI that is called graph.microsoft.com.default. And so this is the request, and we can test that by, hopefully it works. So it worked before, so it should work again. So if we execute that, and we see now we get a response, a JSON response with an access token, it's this one, and an expiry. So this token expires and cannot be used then after 3,599 seconds. So every token has an expiry, and which is more relevant for authorization code flows or when a user interacts with it. But it's still, you still have to take care that your token does not expire, especially when you're using tokens in long-running processes, for example. Okay, so that's the token. We copy that to the response body, click on finish. And now we have an action or a REST consume action token that takes a grant type, client ID, client secret, scope, and delivers a response. And we wrap that in an action. Okay, and the big question is, where do I store now client ID and client secret? So there is an insecure way, I guess you figured that out. So where you store the app client ID and the client secret in a site property. So which in plain text, which in the end allows everyone who has access to Service Center to retrieve that client secret. And that client secret, if you add more and more permissions to your application, someone that has the client secret has in the end, superpowers in your organization. So typically, you don't want to store the client secret in plain text. But I've prepared something else where I show you how you can secure the client secret. So we use now this token, fill in use the site property, client ID, client secret, and then we have our scope. which is graph.microsoft.com/default. And if that succeeds, we just return the token here. So we have the access token, token type, and expires in. Oh, I guess okay. I thought I already changed that, but I didn't. Okay, so if this works, this gets now an access token via REST consume. We just return a success here, which is true, and publish that. And move over to our web application, where we use that now. I already prepared that. So what I did here in this web application, that I created 3 distinct buttons for requesting a token. So the first one is now for requesting a token via the method we just created, via the REST method we just created. The other one is for using an extension method, which we do next. And the last one is, having a way to request a token with an encrypted client secret. So we talk about that in a bit. So in this case, this data action is responsible for retrieving the token via REST. So that's the action we just modified. Let's just refresh that, apply it, and try it out. Okay, publishing during a webinar is quite boring. It always takes some time. Okay, let's try it out. So if everything works fine, we should now get an access token. No, I don't get an access token. I'm not authorized. Oh my God, I know why. Because we haven't set our site properties, right? So where is it? The intro token service. Yeah. So let me just change that to the application ID we created. And the client secret. Okay, but now, yeah, okay. So now it's working. So after we provided the client secret, we received now a valid access token, which we can then use to do something with Graph API. And what we do is that we are consuming an endpoint which is which allows us to send an email via a mailbox. And a mailbox can either be a user mailbox or a resource mailbox. So to figure out what parameters such an endpoint is taking, there is a tool available from Microsoft which is called the Graph Explorer. Very, very nice. So you can go here, and it it should automatically log you on with your organizational account. And then you can try out, not all, but lots of Graph API REST endpoints, for example, by sending an email. So I can go here, send an email. So I'm logged on now as my account, and I can just change the to address here to my account. Hit the run query button. I get an accepted call, which in the end should lead to an email that the new cafeteria is open. So the new cafeteria is open, sent from my account to my account via Graph API with my permissions. And my permissions are, and we have another one. Okay. Okay. And what we do now is that we take this part here, go back to Service Studio, open our GraphMail send integration service, send, add another REST consume, which is a post action, this here. And when using the Graph Explorer, you notice something like this. It's always graph.microsoft.com, the version of the Graph API, and then this me. And instead of me, you can also write users and a so-called principal name, which is in my organization, the principal name is an email address. Okay. And as you see, it works the same way, but now not specifying that me part, but a principal name. And that principal name can also be a resource mailbox. So for example, I have a resource mailbox, which is called feedback at Spatium1. And if I run that query now, I see I am denied. So I have a user access token here, and that user is not allowed to send an email via the mailbox of the principal feedback at Spatium1. So that's a user token. But our application token should be able to send via this one. But anyhow, so we copy this path. So you should, for applications, you should always go with this users and then principal name. Go here, exchange this to a variable. We call this principal. And add. Okay, now we click on finish here. Okay, oops. 2. So this REST API, so we consume an access token via the Entra token service. And now we need to send over that access token when consuming a Graph API. And this is done in the authorization header. So this is what we add. So we add an authorization header, which takes our access token as input parameter. And then we use this action in our wrapper, in our Graph send mail access token wrapper. And that authorization header must be prefixed by the word bearer. So we add this plus the input variable of that wrapper action. Take the principal, that's the UPN. And We have a subject. We have a body. No, we don't have a body. We have a body with the content of this and a single recipient with an email address. Two. And we return a success. True. Okay. In order to get all the details of a single endpoint, Microsoft provides a very good documentation in the API reference, where you can look up all the details you can send with a message or sending an email, all the properties it gets, like here. So you can send an email to multiple recipients, including setting flags, and many, many, many more things. So the API documentation contains all the properties you can set. So for now, the only thing we do is that we send an email to a single recipient with a text body, and we published that here. Now we want to use this send mail access token action in our front-end application, which is on this screen. So we're sending now using this action, this graph send mail. So we hand over the access token, which is stored in a client variable, and then the details from the form, which are then used to query Graph API. Okay, so let's update this. Let's see if it's working. So we have a token, so the action here puts it into a client variable. Let's try to send an email. We want to send now via my own. So our application is able to send an email via any mailbox. I'm sending this to this. Hello from webinar. Hello. We send that email. And I got that email. And now, since the application can send on behalf of every mailbox, we have that other mailbox, that feedback at sending this email. And now I received that email from the feedback resource mailbox. Very nice. So this demonstrates how powerful those application permissions are. And especially mail send is really problematic because that application can now send, if you have an organization with tens of thousands of mailboxes, it can send on behalf of every mailbox. So Microsoft recommends to, not only Microsoft, anyone should recommend to strip that down. And you get more information how you can do that in the Microsoft Graph permissions reference. So if you go here, you find that in the presentation and search for mail send. That here Microsoft recommends to configure application access policies to limit that application to use only a certain mailbox, for example, a resource mailbox. So this is on how to consume a Graph API endpoint. To wrap that up, you acquire an access token. we use this module to acquire an access token using client ID and client secret via the client credentials flow. And then we use the acquired access token to consume a REST API endpoint in another service module, handing over the access token, and then executing a post request to the sendmail endpoint of Graph API. Super simple. And you can use any other Graph API endpoint, but don't forget to add the proper permissions before you do so. So it's always you add the consume, head over the authorization access token, requested resource with the access token, and that's it. Okay. So first part. Second part, or second thing is you don't have to consume a token manually. So this costs you an AO, so an application object. So recently, people get a little bit nervous about AOs. So this costs you an AO. You can also use a Forge component, which is called OAuth token exchange. That is a custom code extension, which does the same. So it just calls the token endpoint you configure, hands over client ID and client secret, and returns an access token. So let's do that as well. So here I already installed this component in my environment. So it's this one, OAuth token exchange, you find on the Forge. You take the OAuth client credential token and do the same. So you copy the token endpoint URL, which is the client ID. Client secret. And the scope. And then we assign the result to the response of this request. And this is now the second option here, which acquires a token via the extension. So the extension is 0 AOs. So okay. On the other hand, it's custom code, right? Okay, let's try it out. So we set it. Request the token via extension. And oh, it didn't work. Oh my God. That's bad. What did I miss? Maybe I should have used here the site properties. Let's add some. Okay. And this one now requests a token via the extension. Okay, so the last part missing is that client secret thing. So for now, the client secret is stored in plain text in a site property, which you shouldn't do. So this is highly confidential, and you should either encrypt it or offload it to an external system. So my recommendation is to use either or to use something like AWS Secrets Manager or HashiCorp Vault to store those client secrets outside of OutSystems and consume it from there whenever you need it. The other option is to encrypt the client secret, and that can be done internally using the crypto API. So in order to do so, you need to install crypto API, and you need to create two site properties. One for storing a key, which is generated by crypto API. And the other one is for storing an encrypted client secret. Okay, so, and to create an encrypted client secret, you need some sort of administration application where you enter a client secret, click on save, and then crypto API encrypts that client secret and stores it in an encrypted way. And whenever you need the client secret, you do the other way around. So reading the crypto API key and decrypting the client secret, and then using the client secret to acquire a token. The special thing is why this is more secure than writing it in plain text is I created a set client secret action, which does the following. So it checks first if the crypto API key site property has a value. If not, I ask crypto API to generate a new key. So that is a 256-bit key. And then I save the key with this environment mode. Pretty cool what the creator of that component did. Because this saving key does the following. It takes the private key of your environment. So for example, of your development environment. And that key is shared across all your front-end servers. It's stored in a file. It takes that key and encrypts this key here, this new key, using that private key of the environment and returns it. And this encrypted key I store in the crypto API key site variable. So even the key is not plain text in a site property. The key itself is encrypted and then stored as a site property. Then I read that key, encrypt, once again from the environment, so from the site property, using the environment, which means it takes the private key of the environment to decrypt that key. And then I encrypt that client secret and write it to a site property. And then I have a cipher text in my site property. It looks like this. So let's just check. I did that before. So, and then, so this is the encrypted key. And this is the encrypted client secret stored in a site property, which is good if you have just single credentials. So you can go ahead and do it in a site property typically that shouldn't change often, depending on the lifetime of your client secret. So maybe 30 days, 90 days, whatever you have set during application registration. And then in order to get the unencrypted key, so here, get this server action or acquires a token using that encrypted key now. And this first gets the client secret. And the client secret is, it reads the key, it reads the crypto API key, decrypts it. And then I have the decrypted client secret, which I return. And then I use the same thing. So in this case, the extension to acquire an access token. So this is one way how you can raise a little bit the security of a client secret. Okay, so for you later to review. So 2 minutes left. Okay, so I guess I have to postpone the Q&A part and gather all the questions and write you afterwards some answers. But going back to our presentation. So what you should do is that you register an application with Entra per OutSystems application. So in the demo, we only have single credentials, but potentially good practice would be to extend that token acquisition service to support multiple applications, multiple credentials. So one for each OutSystems application to prevent that you have a single pair of credentials with superpowers in your organizations. So just as we saw, you shouldn't store the client secret anywhere in plain text. So encrypt it, good. Better is to externalize it and store it somewhere where it's really safe, like AWS Secrets Manager or HashiCorp Vault. Build a central access token retrieval service, especially if you're using the REST consume method to acquire a token to prevent additional unnecessary application objects. And do not use the hard-coded client credentials built-in support. Oh, I missed that. So there is a new option in OutSystems in Service Studio if you have a platform version 11.23.1. And here you can do, what you can do here is very, actually somewhat nice, somewhat bad. Whenever you consume something, you can set the OAuth client credentials directly here. Which is easy to use, and hopefully OutSystems stores it in a safe manner somewhere. I don't know where it's stored. I don't like this approach because every time the client secret changes, and it should change over time, it would mean that you have to republish this integration service. And it also would mean that you only have a single pair of credentials for all applications consuming this service. And I think it's better to have separate client credentials per applications and not a single credential pair of client ID and client secret. So, but this is the third option, but I do not recommend using it. So you should keep it separate. But it's easy to use. Okay. So you find lots of additional links in the document you can download in the chat. So including access to the portal, the documentation I've shown, the permission reference, the Graph Explorer, and the 2 Forge components I'm using here. And that's it for today. Thank you very much. Let me just look at the QA. Okay, so did you already integrate with other Azure Key Vault for safe storage of keys and auto rotation? Me being a great AWS fanboy, no. But I guess, and I didn't know, I don't know Azure Key Vault, so I can't say, but I would think that it provides the same functionality like AWS Secrets Manager or HashiCorp Vault, but personally, I don't have experience in integrating with Azure Key Vault. Okay, so does MS Graph provide Swagger generation capabilities similar to what AWS Gateway provides? There are some third-party Swagger descriptions available, as far as I know. Microsoft itself doesn't. So no Swagger definitions files. These were just two questions. Okay, now let's see in the chat. Okay, thanks. Okay, so if there is anything else, reach out to me. Okay, connect with me on LinkedIn. Hopefully you read my blog and you know my blog. I try to post regularly new articles on my blog. And yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for joining, and see you next time. Bye-bye.